The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around my wrists with a heavy, metallic click. I didn't even blink. 3 armed sheriff's deputies were screaming right in my face, their service weapons drawn and ready, practically begging for me to burst into tears or start begging for mercy. Instead, they got absolutely nothing but terrifying silence. They thought they had just bagged a helpless drifter. They had no idea they'd just poked a sleeping leviathan. Inside the grimy windows of Higgins' diner, dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight. Oak Haven, Texas was a ghost town pretending to be a real community. A forgotten stretch of highway where the asphalt was cracked and the local law enforcement operated like a cartel. I was sitting in a corner booth, nursing a lukewarm black coffee and a plate of cherry pie. To anyone looking, I was just another weary traveler passing through. I had on a faded olive drab jacket, denim jeans, and a pair of scuffed combat boots. My vintage 1978 Ford Bronco, parked right out front, bore Colorado plates. But underneath that unassuming exterior lay a lethal resume. I am a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and one of the few women to successfully integrate into the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as DevGRU, or SEAL Team 6. Right now, I was on a mandatory 3-week administrative leave following a highly classified kinetic extraction operation in the Horn of Africa. All I wanted was to drive across the country in absolute peace. Oak Haven's corrupt ecosystem, however, had other plans. The diner's rusted bell violently clanged against the glass as the front door was kicked wide open. 3 uniformed deputies stormed in, their heavy-duty tactical boots thudding against the checkered linoleum floor. Right behind them was Sheriff Boyd Miller, a thick-necked man with a brass star pinned to his swelling chest, and Thomas Granger, a plainclothes investigator whose crooked reputation was an open secret across 3 surrounding counties. "Nobody move! Keep your hands where I can see them!" Sheriff Miller bellowed, his right hand resting aggressively on the butt of his sidearm. The 2 truck drivers sitting at the counter immediately raised their hands, their eyes wide with fear. The elderly waitress behind the register shrank back against the coffee machines. I didn't flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, my eyes calmly scanning the room. In a fraction of a second, my brain shifted into a combat-hardened analytical mode. Threat assessment time. Deputy 1 on my left flank. Sweating profusely, poor trigger discipline, holding a Remington 870 shotgun. Deputy 2, center, overweight, breathing heavily, right hand trembling over a Glock 19. Sheriff Miller, arrogant, overconfident, standing completely out of the fatal funnel of the doorway. Agent Granger, trailing behind, assessing the room with the predatory gaze of a pure opportunist. "Hey, you in the corner booth?" Miller barked, pointing a thick, calloused finger directly at me. "Stand up slowly and put your hands flat on the table." I complied. I didn't ask what was going on. I didn't demand to know my rights. I stood up with a fluid grace, placed my palms flat on the sticky Formica table, and locked eyes with the sheriff. "Turn around, hands behind your back," Deputy 1 ordered, stepping forward and shoving the barrel of his shotgun into the small of my back. It was a stupid amateur tactical mistake. In a real close-quarters scenario, I could have disarmed him in a heartbeat, used him as a human shield, and neutralized the remaining 3 men before Granger could even draw his weapon. Instead, I just offered my wrists. The cold steel of the Smith & Wesson handcuffs bit into my skin. They clicked tightly, far too tightly. "We got a hit on the Bronco outside," Granger said, stepping into my peripheral vision. He leaned in close, chewing on a toothpick, reeking of cheap drugstore cologne and stale tobacco. An anonymous tip said it was transporting a significant quantity of Schedule I narcotics across state lines. And what do you know? We found a duffel bag full of crystal meth shoved right under the back seat. It was a blatant lie. My truck held nothing but my camping gear, a heavily secured Pelican case containing my custom Sig Sauer P320, and a locked toolbox. They had planted the drugs. This was a classic civil asset forfeiture trap. They targeted out-of-state plates, planted narcotics, seized the vehicle and any cash the driver carried, and then intimidated the victim into taking a plea deal to avoid 20 years in state prison. "You have the right to remain silent," Sheriff Miller sneered, leaning in so close I could smell the sour coffee on his breath. "Though I suggest you start talking if you want to see the sunshine outside of a cell any time in the next decade." I looked directly into his eyes. My face was an impenetrable mask of stone. I initiated a standard box breathing technique. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. It slowed my heart rate down to a glacial 60 beats per minute. "Not a talker, huh?" Granger chuckled, giving my shoulder a hard shove toward the door. "That's fine. We love the quiet ones. They always crack the loudest when the reality of county lockup sets in." They marched me out of the diner while the local patrons stared in hushed horror. They slammed me into the back of a caged Ford Explorer cruiser. Throughout the entire ordeal, the rough handling, the false accusations, the public humiliation, I said absolutely nothing. I didn't utter a single syllable. This profound silence began to subtly unnerve Deputy 1, who was driving the cruiser. He kept glancing at me nervously in the rearview mirror. Usually suspects screamed, cried, begged for a lawyer, or threatened to sue. But I was just sitting there, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes tracking the route. I was memorizing street signs, turns, and the response times of the local dispatch crackling over the radio. I wasn't acting like prey. I was acting like a predator studying its cage. "She's psycho, boss," the young deputy muttered into his radio. "Just drive, kid." Miller's voice crackled back from the lead vehicle. "We got a live one today. By midnight, she'll be signing over the pink slip to that Bronco just to get a phone call." They had no idea that I didn't need a phone call, because when a Tier 1 operator goes dark, the chain of command doesn't wait for a ransom demand. They send the hunters. The Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department was a brutalist block of cracked red brick and bulletproof glass, isolated on the dusty outskirts of town. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a headache-inducing hum, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the linoleum floors. They tossed me into Interrogation Room B, a windowless box smelling of bleach and old sweat, and bolted my handcuffs to a heavy steel ring embedded in the table. For 2 hours, they left me entirely alone, a standard psychological tactic meant to break a suspect's resolve through isolation and anxiety. When the heavy metal door finally squealed open, Agent Granger and Sheriff Miller walked in. Granger tossed a thick manila folder onto the table with a theatrical slap. "All right, Jane Doe," Granger said, pulling out an uncomfortable metal chair and scraping it harshly across the floor. "You had no wallet on you, no ID in the truck, just a whole lot of camping gear and $50,000 street value of methamphetamine. You're looking at federal trafficking charges." He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. "Here's how this plays out. You tell us your name, you sign this full confession, and you sign the asset forfeiture release for the truck and the cash we found in your glove box. You do that, and I'll talk to the local DA. Maybe we knock it down to simple possession and you do 2 years at a minimum security facility. You don't sign, I bury you in a federal penitentiary for 25 years to life." I blinked slowly. I looked at Granger's tie, noting the slight tremor in his fingers. He was a low-level bully, entirely reliant on fear to maintain control. I looked at Miller, who was leaning against the doorframe, chewing on a thumbnail. Still, I said nothing. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. "Are you deaf?" Miller snapped, stepping forward and slamming his fist on the metal table. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." My gaze shifted to the sheriff. My eyes were dead, devoid of any emotion, reflecting the cold calculation of a woman who had stared down heavily armed insurgents in the mountains of Yemen. Miller actually took a half step back, suddenly struck by an involuntary shiver. There was a dangerous gravity to my stillness. "Fine, play hardball," Granger spat, visibly agitated by my lack of response. "Let's get her printed. The FBI database will tell us exactly who this mute is." They unbolted me from the table and aggressively marched me down the hall to the booking area. Deputy Chris Fowler, A nervous 20-something kid fresh out of the academy was manning the live scan digital fingerprinting machine. "Put her hands on the glass, Fowler," Miller ordered. "Roll them flat." Fowler unlocked my right hand and guided my fingers onto the glowing green scanner. "Press down, ma'am," he mumbled politely, clearly intimidated by the heavy atmosphere my silence had created. I pressed my index finger onto the glass. The machine beeped. A green progress bar appeared on Fowler's monitor as the system connected to the AFIS database, pinging local, state, and federal records. Then the machine stopped. The green scanning light turned violently red. The standard police interface on Fowler's dual monitors vanished, replaced instantly by a stark, solid black screen. In the center, bright crimson text began to flash rapidly. "Warning, Department of Defense Directive 814.0, clearance level top secret //SCI//Yankee. White required subject identity restricted. Do not detain. Do not interrogate. Stand by for Pentagon command override." Deputy Fowler froze, the color draining entirely from his face. Sheriff." "What is it, Fowler? Does she have a warrant?" Miller barked, marching over to the monitors. Miller's eyes locked onto the flashing red text. His jaw went completely slack. Agent Granger quickly pushed past him to look at the screen. "What the hell is this?" Granger muttered, his authoritative facade finally cracking. "Top secret Yankee White. That's presidential security clearance. Fowler, run it again. The machine is glitching." I can't, sir," Fowler stammered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "The whole system is locked. The keyboard is dead. I can't even open a new window. It's like someone completely hijacked the network." Granger spun around to look at me. I was standing perfectly still, my face an unreadable mask. But for the first time since they had arrested me, the corner of my mouth twitched upward into the absolute faintest ghost of a smile. Suddenly, all the overhead fluorescent lights in the precinct flickered wildly and died, plunging the room into total darkness for 3 agonizing seconds before the backup generators kicked in with a low, rumbling hum. The lights returned at half strength, casting long, sinister shadows across the booking room. The main dispatch radio on Fowler's desk erupted into a deafening screech of static. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Miller. What the hell is happening to the grid?" Miller yelled, grabbing his shoulder mic. "Only dead," hissing static answered back. "My cell phone has no service," Granger said, his voice dropping an octave as he pulled his phone from his jacket, desperately waving it in the air. "It says no network. That's impossible. We have a cell tower 2 miles from here." "The landlines are dead too," Fowler whispered, picking up the desk phone and listening to the absolute silence on the receiver. "Sheriff, our VHF radios, the internet, the phones, we are completely cut off." "It's a jammer," Granger realized, the blood running cold in his veins. He looked at me, genuine terror finally bleeding into his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" I remained perfectly, terrifyingly silent. A low, deep vibration began to rattle the floorboards beneath our boots. It wasn't the high-pitched wail of police sirens. It was the heavy, menacing, synchronized rumble of massive diesel engines approaching from the pitch-black highway outside. Multiple heavy vehicles were closing in. Fowler crept toward the reinforced window, peering out through the horizontal blinds at the front parking lot. "Sheriff," Fowler's voice broke into a high-pitched squeak. There are trucks out there, big ones, matte black, no police markings, Lenko Bearcats and blacked-out SUVs." "Local SWAT?" Miller asked, drawing his weapon, his hands shaking violently. "No," Fowler whispered, stepping back from the glass, his eyes wide with unadulterated panic. "They're wearing panoramic night vision and gear I've never even seen before." Before Miller could formulate a response, the heavy silence of the room was pierced by a tiny, almost imperceptible click. Granger looked down. A perfectly round, ruby-red laser dot was resting dead center on his chest, bleeding through the fabric of his cheap suit. It had bypassed the window blinds and was tracking his every breath. A second later, Another red dot appeared directly in the center of Sheriff Miller's forehead. The sleeping Leviathan had woken up, and it had brought its friends. The ruby-red laser dots held perfectly steady, unwavering in the dim, generator-powered light of the booking room. One rested over the left ventricle of Agent Thomas Granger's heart, while the other was painted dead center on the sweaty forehead of Sheriff Boyd Miller. "Drop the weapon, Sheriff," a voice echoed. It didn't come from inside the room. It came from a localized, high-frequency directional speaker mounted outside, penetrating the reinforced walls with terrifying clarity. "Interfere with this operation, and you will be neutralized. You have 5 seconds to comply." Miller's fingers went completely numb. The heavy Glock 19 slipped from his trembling grip, clattering loudly against the linoleum floor. He raised his hands, his face completely drained of color. Granger, usually a master of aggressive posturing, was hyperventilating. His eyes locked onto the red dot illuminating the lapel of his cheap suit. "I'm federal," Granger screamed, his voice cracking into a high pitch, desperate to establish authority. "I am a sworn agent of the Drug Enforcement Administration. You are interfering with a federal investigation." There was no verbal response. Instead, the heavy, reinforced steel door at the front entrance of the precinct simply ceased to exist. A specialized, low-yield linear-shaped charge had been applied to the hinges and deadbolt. The detonation wasn't a chaotic, fiery explosion, but a sharp, concussive crack that sucked the air out of the room and blew the heavy door inward like a piece of cardboard. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, the fatal funnel of the doorway was filled with shadows moving at impossible speeds. 8 operators flooded the lobby in perfect, unspoken synchronization. They wore no police markings, no badges, and no recognizable agency insignias. They were clad in matte black Crye precision combat uniforms, heavy plate carriers, and advanced bump helmets equipped with 4-tube GPNVG-18 panoramic night vision goggles. They moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of apex predators who had spent their entire adult lives mastering the art of controlled violence. "Hands on your heads, fingers interlaced, get on your knees." The commands weren't shouted in a panic. They were delivered with the booming, absolute authority of men who expected instant compliance. Deputy Fowler immediately dropped to his knees, interlaced his fingers, and buried his face against the floor, sobbing quietly. He wanted absolutely no part of whatever apocalypse had just arrived in Oak Haven. Miller and Granger followed a second later, violently shoved to the floor by 2 operators who moved past them like they were nothing more than inconvenient furniture. The muzzles of suppressed HK-416 assault rifles remained fixed on the back of the corrupt officers' heads. A 9th man stepped through the smoke of the ruined doorway. He wasn't wearing night vision. He wore a subdued tactical uniform, a heavy plate carrier, and a headset over one ear. He had the rugged, weathered face of a man who had seen combat on multiple continents. The name tape on his chest simply read, "Hayes." Master Chief Hayes didn't look at the sheriff, nor did he look at the DEA agent. He walked straight through the booking room, his heavy boots crunching over the shattered glass of the front entrance, and stopped directly in front of the fingerprinting station. I was still standing there, one hand locked to the metal rail of the booking desk by Fowler's handcuffs. Hayes reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, and effortlessly snapped the chain of the Smith & Wesson cuffs. The metal rings fell to the floor with a dull clink. "Commander Rhee," Hayes said, his voice dropping into a tone of deep, unwavering respect as he offered a sharp, informal salute. "Apologies for the delay. Traffic on the interstate was a nightmare." I massaged my wrists, my face finally relaxing from its stone-cold mask. I looked at the Master Chief, then at the heavily armed operators holding the room in absolute gridlock. "You brought the whole platoon, Hayes?" I asked softly. My voice was calm, raspy, and carried the quiet weight of someone completely accustomed to command. When the Pentagon's automated system flags a Tier 1 asset as illegally detained and non-responsive in a known hostile jurisdiction, Hayes replied, a grim smile playing on his lips. JSOC doesn't send a strongly worded letter. They sent us, and we brought some friends. From the breached doorway, a new figure emerged. Unlike the tactical operators, this man wore a crisp, dark suit and a tactical FBI windbreaker. He flashed a golden badge as he stepped over the ruined doorframe. "Special Agent Bradley, FBI Anti-Corruption Task Force," the man announced, his voice echoing through the silent room. He looked down at the trembling forms of Miller and Granger. "Well, Sheriff, it looks like you finally pulled over the wrong car." The precinct was now entirely under federal control. Outside, heavily armored Lenco Bearcats blocked every exit, and a secure perimeter had been established. Inside, the arrogant swagger of the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department had been thoroughly dismantled. Sheriff Miller and Agent Granger were kneeling on the floor, their hands bound securely behind their backs with thick plastic flex cuffs. The red lasers were gone, replaced by the harsh, unyielding reality of federal custody. "This is a mistake," Granger spat, struggling against the plastic ties, his desperation making him reckless. "She's a mule. We found 50 grand worth of crystal meth in her vehicle. You're aiding and abetting a cartel smuggler." Agent Bradley excelled at a dry, humorless chuckle. He looked over at one of the SEAL operators standing by the precinct's computer servers. "Sparks, what do we have?" The operator known as Sparks tapped his keyboard, bypassing the precinct's rudimentary security firewall in less than 30 seconds. "I have complete control of their internal network, sir. Accessing patrol car dash cams and precinct body camera footage now." Sparks turned one of the monitors toward the room. The screen flickered, showing the high-definition dash cam footage from Deputy 1's cruiser parked outside the diner just 2 hours ago. The video clearly showed Agent Granger opening the trunk of his own unmarked sedan, removing a sealed black duffel bag, and walking over to my vintage Bronco. The footage showed him explicitly picking the lock on my tailgate, shoving the bag under the rear seat, and giving a thumbs up to Sheriff Miller. The room went dead silent. The undeniable proof of their corruption was playing on a continuous loop for a room full of federal agents and military operators. That's manipulated footage," Miller stammered, sweat pouring down his flushed face. "Deep fake! You're framing us!" "Save it for the federal judge, Boyd," Bradley said coldly, stepping closer to the kneeling sheriff. "My task force has been building a racketeering and civil rights violation case against your little highway robbery ring for 8 months. You've been seizing cash from innocent civilians, planting evidence, and destroying lives just to line your own pockets. We were just waiting for the right moment to drop the hammer." Bradley gestured respectfully toward me as I casually leaned against the booking desk, observing the entire scene with detached clinical interest. "We needed a catalyst," Bradley continued, "and you geniuses decided to frame a highly decorated naval special warfare officer holding Yankee white security clearance. When you forced her fingerprints onto that AFIS scanner, you didn't just ping the FBI. You tripped a Department of Defense critical alert. You essentially declared war on the Pentagon." Granger stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. The silent, stoic woman they had abused, shoved, and threatened wasn't a victim. She was a weapon, and they had pulled the pin. "You could have said something," Granger yelled at me, his voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "You could have told us who you were. You let us do this." I pushed myself off the desk and walked slowly toward Granger, my combat boots thudding softly against the floor. The heavy, intimidating presence of the SEAL operators seemed to part for me, deferring to my rank. I stopped right in front of the kneeling DA agent, looking down at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Arctic Sea. "I didn't let you do anything," I said, my voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register that forced everyone in the room to listen. "I sat there and watched you operate. I watched you threaten an innocent waitress. I watched you violate the Constitution you swore an oath to protect. I gave you every single opportunity to do the right thing, to be the law enforcement officers you claim to be." I leaned in closer until Granger had to look away from my piercing gaze. "You rely on fear because you are fundamentally weak," I whispered, the words hitting him like physical blows. You target people you think can't fight back. You aren't law enforcement. You're a roadside bandit wearing a tin star. And today, you decided to hijack the wrong convoy. I stood up, dismissing him entirely, and turned to Master Chief Hayes. Chief, are my personal effects secure? Yes, Commander, Hayes replied smoothly. Your sidearm and keys have been retrieved from the evidence locker. The planted narcotics have been secured by the FBI for trial. Your vehicle is ready. Good. I looked over at Deputy Fowler, who was still kneeling by the wall, shaking violently. I walked over to him. Fowler braced himself, squeezing his eyes shut as if expecting a blow. Instead, I reached out and tapped him firmly on the shoulder. You didn't draw your weapon, and you didn't lie on the radio, I said quietly to the young rookie. When the FBI interviews you, tell them exactly what your superiors ordered you to do. Do not protect them. This is your only chance to salvage your life. Next time, choose a better department. Fowler nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I turned and walked toward the ruined front entrance. The tactical operators fell into a protective diamond formation around me as I exited the building. Outside, the cool Texas night air hit my face, wiping away the lingering stench of corruption and bleach from the precinct. My vintage Ford Bronco was parked right in the center of the perimeter, surrounded by heavily armed federal agents and military personnel holding the line. Agent Bradley called out from the doorway, "Commander Rhee, enjoy the rest of your administrative leave. We'll handle the garbage disposal here." I didn't look back. I climbed into the driver's seat of my Bronco, the worn leather feeling familiar and comforting. I started the engine, the classic V8 roaring to life with a satisfying rumble. As I put the truck in gear and drove slowly through the corridor of armored vehicles, I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time. The flashing red and blue lights of the arriving federal backup illuminated the shattered front doors of the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department. Inside, the men who had thought they were untouchable gods of their small town were being dragged away in chains. I turned the radio on, letting a classic rock station wash over the cabin, and merged back onto the dark, open highway. For the first time all day, I smiled. The silence of the road finally felt earned.